Thank you very much for this introduction, and greetings, friends. I'm glad to join you from Geneva, though I join you in a personal capacity. I have not yet joined the World Council of Churches, and I've recently left the employ of Council for World Mission. So it's really in a personal capacity that I join you today. I should say that before anybody sues me. I wanted to begin my reflection with a story, which I think begins to illustrate some of the issues around ecumenism, coloniality, and mission. Some of you will know CDM recently offered an act of confession and commitment for the legacies of slavery in its life in South Africa back in August. It took place in Bethelsdorp, the first mission station LMS founded outside the Cape Colony. And I traveled there through Johannesburg to, I thought, Port Elizabeth. But when I received my ticket in Johannesburg, it had a word and a name I could not fathom to say: GQEBERHA. I boarded my plane and I sat in the middle seat of a row with two very large white South African men either side, and when the cabin crew announced the destination as Gqeberha, they both sat forward to look past me at each other and said, "We will never call it that." And then a white woman sitting in front of me in the same seat in the row ahead turned around and said, "Yes, we will always call it Port Elizabeth." And now these two rows of white folk all seem to kind of cheer almost at this act of dissent. So I sat in the middle of this row of angry white people and determined to myself, I will never call it Port Elizabeth again, and practice saying Gqeberha for the next 20 minutes, because I thought, if this name pisses off these guys so much, I'm going to use it all the time. However, of course, how I learned to say it is not how you should say it. Anyway, we arrived in the city's airport, which is now named after Dawit Stearman, chief of the Khoi people, who was a rebel leader fighting the colonialists in the 19th century, and in fact met the LMS, Van der Kemp and Reed, and negotiated with them, as it were, for the land on which the Bethelsdorp mission station was placed, or taken, or stolen. And the Khoi people provided security, they provided labor, and they provided land, they provided translation for the LMS on that space. Now, the LMS patron, Lord Clarendon, ordered that Stearman be arrested as a marauder and a rebel. And Stearman was among the first political prisoners to be taken to Robben Island. In fact, he escaped from there and was taken back, but was eventually transported to Australia, where he died. And we met in our act of confession his direct descendant, who set our event alight, recounting the history of ecumenism, coloniality, and mission from the LMS arrival, and remarked that this name, Gqeberha, still doesn't recognize that this land is Khoi land, for Gqeberha is a Xhosa name and represents a Xhosa claim on Khoi land. So that once again, the Khoi have been edged out of history, cleared out of their land by the political interests of the new South Africa, continuing what was done by the old. So why do I tell this story? Well, it reminds us that despite or because of 60 years of liberation theology, we are still living through decolonizing liberation struggles, and the decolonizing work of the 50s, 60s, and 70s is not complete. Colonial power and epistemologies continue to operate, and according to Stearman, Gqeberha is still the imposition of a colonial name. It's Khoi land, not Xhosa, so the name should reflect that. And so the Khoi must rise to struggle again, not just against neo-colonial white power, but post-colonial black power too. So Stearman was telling us that decoloniality, as a subverting and resisting hegemonic power and logic, is an unending posture and a habit to take to the 8th generation and more. Well, I hardly need to expand on the mission complicity of these 8th generation and its waves of coloniality, but I will observe it's becoming oddly unwelcome to highlight mission complicity in coloniality and neo-coloniality, even to those who are supposedly rooted in decolonization. I certainly wonder if today's generation of leadership would even wish to attempt the kind of system change that the leaders of the first wave of decolonization sought. In the context of ecumenism, movements like the World Council of Churches and CWM like to locate themselves in the decolonizing era, believing we are decolonizers, and yet the extension of the emancipatory acts of geographical decolonization, like setting occupied lands free, is still resisted when it's extended to bodies, identities, and epistemologies which are still occupied by patriarchal and kyriarchal Christian power. You can observe that whiteness still acts to convene, permit, and moderate ecumenical space through the power that finance has and the mission movements that were spawned. We still connive with neo-colonial commentators, nuancing coloniality in ways which only ever exonerate mission movements and haul us back, nevertheless, then, into the ways of whiteness. Ecumenism and mission are always in danger of servicing Christian hegemonic interests. Who knew that? And mission movements continue to speak about the world, sins, structures, as if they are above and outside them, able from their all-knowing gaze to prescribe and prescribe the speck in other people's eyes rather than the log in our own. So I want to finish with these thoughts from Stiermann, who offered us a simple benediction to our apology, which immediately transforms the map of coloniality, mission, and ecumenism. He said to our apology, "I have heard you, and I will hold you accountable to what you have said." This was an accounting not simply to him, not simply to the struggle of the Khoi, but an accounting to our own words, to all that we say we are and believe. Because these, fundamentally, Stiermann was telling us, are the site of our coloniality and the seed of our decoloniality. For our words have been our truths, but they have also been our lies. Imagine that. Imagine living out such an accountability to Stiermann, to the Khoi, to that struggle, and to our words. This would offer us a visible unity which would shake not just the ecumenical movements, but break open the world. Thank you. This is all I wish to share at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bev, and thank you so much, Peter, for that presentation. For me, the key statement is from Stiermann, in which he says, "I have heard you, and I will hold you accountable." That is a loaded statement for me, and it makes me think, what ought to be done with such statements? Should the people who were present at this act of confession and commitment for the legacies of slavery just hear this statement and leave it there because it's all in a works day? What are some of the ways in which the Council for World Mission can work around this accountability? Because oftentimes people need for those that are in positions of power to be accountable for the wrongs that disproportionately impacted those perceived as others. This is an act of accountability rather than just talking about it. In fact, Stiermann's statement is an act of faith, of trusting. It's an act of hoping that the acts of the London Mission Society will not be repeated by silence after the act of confession and commitment. This for me means moving from all talk to praxis of decoloniality, which is for me to do more than we say, and rather to live out that which brings justice and liberation to impact positively on those who have been marginalized and have been taken advantage of. And this accountability humanizes both those in positions of power and those who have been taken advantage of. So therefore, Peter, thank you, because this for me means that decolonized ecumenism in this sense is the action of being accountable. And Peter, you have helped us to understand that decolonization is not just about words. It's about listening to the story of people who are faced with numerous challenges, such as imposed names of cities, gender injustices, racism, stories of marginalization, and the list is quite endless. And so listening and retelling those stories is an act of decolonization. And unfortunately, the many injustices continue to linger, even though there have been conversations held within ecumenical spaces. So learning to live out people's stories, learning to understand people's stories before we propose even decolonization is what Peter is telling us here as an act of accountability. And therefore, at times, we have to struggle to learn even to pronounce the difficult names such as Kaebega as a form of decoloniality and as a form of resistance. But we also have to be careful because in naming, we might participate in the neo-colonialism or in the post-colonialism that those in leadership are forging. That is what Peter has demonstrated for us this evening. So we must be wary of easy answers and we have to share in the act of decolonization of ideas. We have to share in the act of decolonization of land, of minds, of languages, of bodies, and of cultures. Accountability is an act of decolonization. This is what we have heard from Peter today. Thank you.